the 18th of August 1960, 120000, feet over the vast indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean. The twin engines of the C-119 flying boxcar screamed a desperate roar against the crushing silence of the upper atmosphere. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the yoke, his eyes locked not on an enemy fighter, but on a tiny plummeting speck falling from the very edge of space. This was no rescue mission. The object dangling from the parachute was not a man. It was a canister, a 300-pound metal capsule containing the most sought-after prize on Earth, a clear view behind the Iron Curtain. For 13 consecutive missions, this prize had been lost, exploding on the launch pad, tumbling into the wrong orbit, or sinking into the ocean's depths. But now, after a year of catastrophic failure, one had finally returned from the void. On the ground, a world held its breath, paralyzed by the phantom terror of a missile gap, the belief that hidden Soviet arsenals were aimed at every American city. The men in the flying boxcar were not just pilots. They were hunters, and their prey was not a physical threat, but ignorance itself. They were tasked with snatching a ghost from the sky, capturing miles of fragile film that held the power to either confirm humanity's worst fears or avert a nuclear holocaust. This was the audacious, seemingly impossible mission of Project Corona, a last-ditch effort to replace deadly guesswork with undeniable sight. This was not the beginning of a battle, but the dawn of an entirely new kind of war, fought not with soldiers, but with secrets, and its opening shot was about to be fired from the heavens. That desperate mid-air ballet, the act of snatching a falling star from the sky, was not an act of bravado. It was the final convulsive move in a global chess match, where one side was playing completely blind. The question was not why they would risk so much for a canister of film, but why they had been driven to a point where such a fantastic gamble was their only remaining option. The answer lay buried deep in the heart of the Cold War, an era defined not by what was known, but by the terrifying, paralyzing power of the unknown. Behind the Iron Curtain, a vast continent had been sealed off from Western eyes, becoming a black hole of information. It was a void across which the specter of Soviet power loomed its true size and strength, a matter of nightmarish speculation. In the paranoid corridors of Washington, this void had a name: the Missile Gap. It was a phantom that haunted the sleep of presidents and generals, a pervasive fear that Nikita Khrushchev was secretly lining the vast Siberian wilderness with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, all aimed squarely at the heart of America. Every Soviet boast, every military parade in Red Square fed the nightmare. Was the enemy building 10 missiles? Or 1,000? The difference was the line between strategic deterrence and total annihilation. To not know was to be strategically naked, to cede the future to an enemy whose intentions were opaque and whose capabilities were a terrifying mystery. For a brief, glorious period, America had a partial answer. It came in the form of the U-2 spy plane, a technological marvel that was more glider than jet, a fragile dragonfly of an aircraft capable of soaring at 7,000 feet far above the reach of Soviet fighters, an anti-aircraft missile. From its perch on the edge of space, the U-2's cameras peeled back the secrets of the closed Soviet empire, photographing airfields, naval bases, and nuclear facilities. Its pilot was a lone knight, a single human being sent to trespass in the Dragon's lair, armed with little more than altitude and audacity. The intelligence was invaluable, but the risk was absolute. Each mission was a roll of the dice, a bet that Soviet technology could not reach them. On the 1st of May 1960, that bet was lost. As Francis Gary Powers piloted his U-2 over the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, the sky below him erupted. A newly developed SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile tore through the thin atmosphere, shattering the delicate aircraft and sending Powers spiraling back to Earth. The fall of this modern-day Icarus was a geopolitical earthquake. It was not just the loss of a plane and the capture of a pilot. It was the violent, definitive end of an era. The door to Soviet airspace had been slammed shut, locked, and bolted. Khrushchev paraded the wreckage and the pilot before the world, humiliating the United States and extinguishing any hope of future overflights. America was blind again, and this time the darkness was deeper and more terrifying than ever. It was from this crucible of failure and fear that Corona was forged. The project was a technological Hail Mary, an idea so ambitious it bordered on the insane. If America could no longer send a man over the Iron Curtain, it would send a machine. It would build an eye, place it in the immutable high ground of orbit, and let it gaze down upon the enemy with impunity. But the challenge was monumental. This was not simply about launching a satellite. It was about creating the world's first automated space-based reconnaissance system from scratch. At the heart of the beast was the KH-1 camera, a masterpiece of optical engineering built by iTech. It was a cyclopean eye 7 feet long with a rotating lens that swept from side to side, capturing a panoramic swath of the Earth below with a resolution that was for its time miraculous. It could distinguish objects on the ground mere dozens of feet across from over 100 miles up. This eye needed a special kind of film engineered by Eastman Kodak to be impossibly thin yet incredibly strong, capable of withstanding the vacuum of space and the brutal G-forces of launch and re-entry. A single mission would carry more than 2 miles of this precious film. But getting the pictures was only half the battle. In an age before digital transmission, the film itself had to be returned to Earth. This led to the program's most audacious and cinematic element, the Satellite Recovery Vehicle, or Film Bucket. After its photographic run was complete, the satellite would orient itself and eject the 300-pound canister. This bucket, protected by a gold-plated heat shield, would plunge back into the atmosphere, glowing like a man-made meteor as it endured temperatures of thousands of degrees. Once it slowed, it would deploy a drogue chute, and then a main parachute drifting gently toward a predetermined recovery zone over the Pacific. It was this descending capsule that the C-119 pilots were tasked with catching in midair, a maneuver designed to ensure the film never touched corrosive saltwater or worse, fell into Soviet hands. This entire Rube Goldberg-esque contraption represented a fundamental philosophical shift in the art of espionage. The U-2 program, for all its technological prowess, still relied on placing a human being in mortal danger. It was a system built around human skill, human courage, and ultimately, human vulnerability. Corona was the antithesis. It was the first step toward removing the fragile human element from the most dangerous part of the equation. It was a declaration that future conflicts would be won not by the bravest spies, but by the most ingenious machines. This was warfare fundamentally transformed, a pivot from personal risk to remote automated precision. It was a system born of desperation, a magnificent complex machine designed for a single purpose: to drag the truth kicking and screaming out of the darkness. That magnificent complex machine, born from the terror of strategic blindness, was finally ready. The theory was sound, the engineering brilliant, the mission existentially necessary. But the unforgiving laws of physics and the brutal reality of pioneering new technology cared little for theories. The journey from the drawing board to a functioning eye in the sky would not be a triumphant procession. It would be a crawl through a valley of fire, a relentless series of failures so complete and so public that it threatened to kill the program before it ever saw a single enemy secret. The early launches from Vandenberg Air Force Base became a grim spectacle of failure. The Thoragina rockets, the powerful steeds meant to carry America's hopes into orbit, proved to be temperamental beasts. The first mission, Discoverer, roared to life in February 1959, only for its telemetry to go silent over the South Pole, its fate unknown, its precious cargo lost to the crushing blackness. It was a ghost, the first of many. Discoverer II successfully reached orbit, a brief flicker of hope, but a timer malfunction sent its recovery capsule ejecting over the Arctic, landing somewhere near Spitsbergen, where it was likely found by the Soviets, a catastrophic security breach. Discoverer III never even made it that far, its rocket tumbling out of control and crashing into the Pacific. The list went on a litany of catastrophic malfunctions that read like an engineer's worst nightmare. Rockets exploded on the launch pad, turning millions of dollars of cutting-edge technology into a plume of acrid smoke and twisted metal. Satellites achieved orbit only to spin wildly, their cameras uselessly pointing at the sun or the empty void. The delicate, specially designed film, the very heart of the mission, would shred itself inside the camera housing, torn apart by the violent G-forces of launch. In one heartbreaking instance, a capsule ejected perfectly survived re-entry and splashed down in the ocean only for its flotation device to fail, and the entire canister, a potential treasure trove of intelligence, to sink 3 miles to the bottom of the Pacific, lost forever. With each failure, the pressure from Washington intensified. The missile gap wasn't shrinking. It was growing into a political firestorm. Senators demanded answers. The CIA and the Air Force, uneasy partners in the clandestine project, pointed fingers at each other. The engineers and scientists working around the clock were pushed to the breaking point. 12 consecutive missions failed in some critical way. The program became a running joke in some corners of the Pentagon, a billion-dollar boondoggle that had produced nothing but a graveyard of ambition. The dream of a God's eye view was dissolving into a nightmare of incompetence. Then in August 1960 came the 13th attempt. The number alone felt like a bad omen. The satellite Discoverer the 13th was launched flawlessly. It circled the globe, and on command its recovery capsule separated and began its fiery descent. In the Pacific, the fleet of Cone 119 seconds circled their crew's nerves frayed from a year of fruitless hunting. This time, the parachute deployed. The capsule was real, but the aerial recovery failed, and the capsule splashed down into the ocean. In a frantic race against time, a Navy helicopter crew managed to snag it just before it sank. It was hauled aboard a ship, the first man-made object ever recovered from orbit. Champagne was popped. It was a monumental technical victory. But when the capsule was opened, it was empty. It had carried no camera, no film. It was a dummy payload, a test to prove the mechanics of recovery could work. They had proven they could catch the bucket, but they still had no idea if they could get the pictures. Just 8 days later, Discoverer 14 roared into the sky. This was it. The satellite was fully equipped with the KH-1 camera system and miles of film. The program's future, and perhaps the strategic balance of the Cold War, rested on this single flight. It soared over the Soviet Union, its panoramic eye silently sweeping across a landscape no American had ever seen with such clarity. Then came the moment of truth. The capsule ejected. It survived re-entry. Its parachute blossomed high over the Pacific. Below, Lieutenant Commander Harold Mitchell piloted his C-119 into position. The men in the back lowered the recovery trapeze, a web of steel cables and hooks designed to snag the parachute. On the first pass, they missed. The capsule swayed violently, a pendulum of hope and failure. They had only minutes before it hit the water. Mitchell banked the clumsy transport plane hard, lining up for another run. The engines screamed in protest. The crew in the back strained their eyes fixed on the descending prize. This time, they flew straight into the parachute's path. A jarring thud, a metallic clank that echoed through the entire aircraft, signaled success. They had it. The Ghost was captured. The plane flew directly to a secure airbase. The capsule rushed onto a waiting jet and flown to Washington, D.C. In a locked subterranean lab, a team of photo interpreters waited. The tension was suffocating. After more than a year of explosive, embarrassing, soul-crushing failure, had they captured anything of value, or would the film be a blurry, useless mess? The first strips of film were developed and hung up to dry. As the ghostly white shapes emerged from the gray emulsion, a hushed reverence fell over the room. There it was. Not a drawing, not a defector's rumor, but a photograph. The unmistakable geometry of a Soviet bomber airfield near Miss Schmidt on the coast of the Chukchi Sea. More images followed naval bases, industrial complexes, and most importantly, the launch sites for their fledgling ICBM program. The team analyzed every inch of the 3,000 feet of film. And as they did, the phantom that had haunted America for years began to evaporate. There were no hundreds of missile silos dotting the Siberian plains. The much-feared missile gap did not exist. In fact, the Soviet ICBM arsenal was shockingly small, numbering in the single digits. The intelligence was stunning, definitive, and world-altering. The first true victory of the space race wasn't planting a flag. It was taking a picture. The success of Discoverer 14 was not merely a technical achievement. It was the strategic equivalent of a nuclear bomb. It had not destroyed a city, but it had utterly annihilated the paralyzing fear and uncertainty that had threatened to drive the world into an all-out arms race. The fire of a dozen failures had forged a weapon more powerful than anyone had imagined. The weapon that emerged from the wreckage of Discoverer 14 was not made of high explosives or fissile material. It was made of light and shadow captured on silver halide crystals. But its impact on the Kremlin was more profound than any bomb. The photographs that unspooled in a darkened Washington lab did more than debunk the missile gap. They declared the beginning of a fundamental, irreconcilable clash of philosophies, a collision between two entirely different worlds and two opposing conceptions of power. It was the cold, calculating logic of the American industrial scientific complex versus the paranoid, deeply human world of Soviet espionage. On one side stood the KGB, the inheritor of a centuries-old tradition of Russian intelligence. Theirs was a world of shadows, of whispered secrets, in rain-slicked European capitals of dead drops and compromised officials. They were masters of the human soul, experts in exploiting greed, ideology, ego, and fear. Their greatest triumphs, like the Cambridge 5 spy ring, had come from patiently penetrating the very heart of their enemies' establishments. The KGB believed with an almost religious fervor that no system was invulnerable because all systems were ultimately run by flawed, corruptible human beings. Their doctrine was built on the intimate, painstaking art of turning a person. They saw the world as a grand terrestrial chessboard, and they were masters of moving the human pieces. Their strength was their profound understanding of the darkness within people. On the other side stood Project Corona, a system that had no soul to master. It was the ultimate expression of a uniquely American philosophy of warfare and intelligence, the belief that any problem, no matter how complex, could be solved by overwhelming it with engineering. It was a Leviathan born not in the shadowy alleys of Vienna, but in the sterile clean rooms of iTech and the sprawling factories of Kodak. This was not the art of espionage, it was the industrialization of it. Where the KGB relied on the singular brilliance or weakness of an individual agent, the American approach relied on the collective anonymous genius of thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians. It was a system of systems, a symphony of rocketry, optics, chemistry, and mechanics, all working in cold, impersonal harmony. Corona was a machine that could not be bribed, blackmailed, or honey-trapped. It felt no fear required, no loyalty, and harbored no ideology. It simply executed its function with inhuman precision. When the first Corona photographs landed on the desks of Soviet intelligence analysts, the psychological shock was seismic. It was a violation on an almost metaphysical level. The Soviet Union's most sacrosanct principle was its secrecy, its ability to shield its vast interior from prying eyes. This secrecy was its primary strategic defense, a curtain of ambiguity behind which it could build, plan, and project an image of strength far greater than the reality. The U-2 had been a terrifying but understandable threat, a physical plane with a human pilot that could, as they proved, be shot down. It was a player in a familiar game. Corona was something else entirely. It was an invisible, omniscient presence. It was a ghost that passed overhead, silently judging their every move. Imagine the paranoia that must have gripped the Kremlin. Every new construction project, every troop movement, every experimental missile test, was it being watched? The very ground beneath their feet, once the bedrock of their empire, now felt like the floor of a brightly lit stage. The psychological impact far exceeded the strategic data it revealed. It created a sense of strategic nakedness, a feeling of being constantly scrutinized by an unblinking, unknowable eye. How do you counter a threat you cannot see, hear, or touch? How do you fight an enemy that exists in the vacuum of space beyond the reach of your most advanced weapons? This helplessness exposed a deeper, more profound gap between the two. Superpowers. The Soviets could build powerful rockets and put the first man in space, monumental achievements, driven by focused, state-directed will. But Corona was a different kind of challenge. It required a level of interdisciplinary integration, quality control, and advanced systems engineering that the rigid, compartmentalized Soviet system struggled to replicate. It wasn't just about building a camera or a rocket. It was about making thousands of complex, interdependent components work together flawlessly under the most extreme conditions imaginable. It was a product of a society that fostered a dynamic interplay between private industry, academic research, and government funding, a flexible, innovative ecosystem that the top-down Soviet command economy could not match. The clash was therefore more than just spy versus spy. It was the assembly line versus the secret police. It was the open, collaborative problem-solving of a technological society versus the closed, paranoid control of an authoritarian state. The KGB could place an agent inside the Pentagon, but they could not replicate the industrial philosophy that built the satellite flying over their heads. They were masters of a 19th-century game of human intrigue, suddenly confronted with a 20th-century weapon of technological omniscience. While they were busy looking for traitors in their midst, the real threat was 100 miles above them. A silent testament to the fact that the future of global power would belong not to the side with the most devoted spies, but to the one that could most effectively turn science into an instrument of statecraft. The psychological blow delivered to the Kremlin was immense, but the true power of Corona lay beyond the enemy's fear and paranoia. Its real value wasn't measured in the silent panic of Soviet generals, but in the quiet confidence it instilled within the Oval Office. The intelligence gleaned from those first miles of film was more than just a collection of tactical data points. It was a strategic Rosetta Stone that fundamentally re-engineered the entire architecture of the Cold War. It transformed the global conflict from a terrifying plunge into a dark, unknown abyss, into a high-stakes but ultimately manageable game of geopolitical chess. The pieces on the board were suddenly visible. Before Corona, American foreign policy was a prisoner of its own imagination. Every decision was clouded by the fog of the missile gap, forcing a posture of worst-case scenario planning. The nation was committing billions to a frantic arms race, building an arsenal to counter a phantom threat. This wasn't strategy. It was a reaction, a convulsive spasm of fear. President Eisenhower and later Kennedy were navigating a hurricane without a map or a compass. The arrival of Corona's intelligence was like the storm breaking, revealing a clear, star-filled sky. For the first time, an American president could make decisions based not on what Khrushchev boasted, but on what the unblinking eye of a satellite actually saw. This newfound clarity changed everything. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, President Kennedy was not operating on fragmented, unreliable human intelligence. He had U-2 photographs, yes, but the broader strategic context, the precise knowledge of the Soviet Union's limited ICBM capabilities was provided by Corona. Knowing that the Soviets did not possess overwhelming nuclear superiority, allowed Kennedy to navigate the razor's edge of brinksmanship with a steady hand. He could afford to impose a naval quarantine and reject calls for an immediate military strike because he understood the true balance of power. He knew Khrushchev was holding a weaker hand than he pretended. Corona didn't just provide pictures of missile sites in Cuba. It provided the global context that made a peaceful resolution possible. It was the silent, unseen arbiter in the most dangerous moment in human history. Beyond crisis management, Corona's steady stream of imagery fundamentally altered the nature of deterrence. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, could only function if both sides had a reasonably accurate understanding of the other's capacity for destruction. By systematically mapping out the Soviet Union's entire military-industrial complex, identifying every bomber-based submarine pin and missile silo, Corona provided the United States with a precise, verifiable target list. This wasn't about planning a first strike. It was about ensuring that the threat of a retaliatory strike was undeniably credible. The abstract terror of nuclear war was replaced by the cold, hard mathematics of megatonnage and kill ratios. It was a grim calculus, but it was a stable one. It established a new set of rules for the game, a brutal but predictable logic that would keep the Cold War from turning hot for decades. But Corona's greatest contribution was not what it did, but what it proved. It was a proof of concept so powerful that it permanently altered the trajectory of modern warfare and statecraft. Every single satellite that followed from the advanced KH-series keyhole spy satellites to the GPS constellation that guides our cars today owes its existence to the crude, cantankerous film bucket system of the 1,960 seconds. Corona proved that orbital reconnaissance was not science fiction. It was a practical, indispensable tool of national power. It opened a new ultimate high ground, the high ground of space, and established a precedent for its use as a domain for surveillance. This was a paradigm shift of historic proportions. For millennia, warfare had been constrained by geography. Armies were stopped by mountains and oceans. But there is no geography in orbit. A satellite can pass over any nation on Earth, ignoring borders, walls, and anti-aircraft batteries with equal impunity. Corona established the principle that a nation's sovereignty did not extend to the vacuum of space, creating a new arena for superpower competition. It single-handedly laid the cornerstone for the era of arms control verification. The landmark Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, SALT of the 1,970 seconds, would have been utterly impossible without the existence of national technical means of verification, a diplomatic euphemism for spy satellites. Trust was not required when you could see for yourself if the other side was dismantling its missiles as promised. Corona turned the heavens into a polygraph machine, allowing bitter adversaries to sign treaties that relied not on faith but on film. Its value therefore transcends the immediate intelligence it gathered. The 36 Soviet ICBMs it located were less important than the path it forged. It was the Wright Flyer of reconnaissance satellites, a clunky, unreliable, and temperamental machine that nonetheless proved flight was possible. It proved that a machine could be sent into the most hostile environment imaginable, perform a complex task with precision, and return its findings to its masters. It demonstrated that the future of intelligence would not be found in the cloak and dagger world of human agents, but in the relentless data-driven gaze of automated systems. It was the first weapon of the information age, a historical inflection point that marked the moment when the power to see became more decisive than the power to destroy. The cornerstone laid by Corona was more than just a foundation for future intelligence gathering. It was the genetic code for a new world. The program itself, with its clumsy film buckets and daring mid-air snags, eventually faded into the black of declassified history. But its ghost lives on. It is a ghost in the machine of the 21st century, its DNA woven into the very fabric of our modern existence in ways both miraculous and menacing. The door that Corona kicked open did not lead to a single room, but to an infinite, sprawling labyrinth of possibilities that we are still exploring today. Its most direct descendants are the technological titans that now silently patrol the orbits above us. The KH-1 film camera evolved into the KH-9 Big Bird, a satellite the size of a school bus that dropped multiple film capsules over its months-long lifespan. This was followed by the true revolution, the KH-11 Cannon, which finally severed the umbilical cord to physical film. It was a digital eye in the sky, transmitting crystal-clear images back to Earth in near real time. The delay of days or weeks was compressed into mere moments. The power to watch an enemy army prepare for battle as it was happening to track a terrorist convoy moving across a desert in real time was a power previously reserved for gods. Every drone strike, guided by a satellite feed, every special forces raid planned with up to the minute imagery, is a direct military heir to the grainy black and white pictures captured by Discoverer 14. But the most profound legacy of Corona is not the one hidden in the classified vaults of the National Reconnaissance Office. It is the one you hold in the palm of your hand. The godlike power that was once the exclusive domain of a superpower purchased with billions of dollars and guarded as a state secret has been democratized and commercialized. When you open Google Maps and zoom in on your own rooftop, you are wielding a civilianized version of the same fundamental technology. The ability to see almost any point on the Earth's surface, to navigate city streets from a satellite's perspective, to watch the world change through a time-lapse of historical imagery. This is Corona's civilian inheritance. Every weather forecast that shows a swirling hurricane, every environmental report that tracks the horrifying retreat of the polar ice caps, every emergency response team assessing earthquake damage from above is leveraging the principles of remote sensing that were pioneered in a desperate Cold War gamble. The world has been rendered transparent, its secrets laid bare not just for presidents and generals, but for anyone with an internet connection. And in this transparent world, we find ourselves grappling with the philosophical demons that Corona first unleashed. The program was founded on a revolutionary and deeply unsettling premise that from the high ground of space, the concept of a sovereign border is meaningless. It established the right of a nation to look into another's territory without permission. For decades, that unblinking eye was turned outward, focused on the other, the enemy. But technology once created has no inherent loyalty. Inevitably, that eye has turned inward. The eternal question that Corona forces upon us is this: if there is no place to hide from our enemies, is there any place to hide from ourselves? We live in an age of pervasive surveillance that would have been unimaginable to the Cold War. Architects of Corona. Governments use satellite imagery to monitor their own populations. Corporations use it to track supply chains and market trends. The line between national security and public privacy has been blurred into non-existence. The same technology that kept the Cold War from turning hot now fuels debates about civil liberties and the nature of a free society. Corona began the process of eroding the very concept of a private space on a global scale. We are all living on a brightly lit stage now, and the audience is everywhere. Ultimately, the humble film bucket stands as one of the most important and least known artifacts of the 20th century. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It dropped no bombs and fired no bullets. And yet it may have been the most effective weapon ever created. It was a weapon that targeted not cities or armies, but a single abstract concept: uncertainty. By destroying uncertainty, it prevented a nuclear war, stabilized a world teetering on the brink of annihilation, and laid the technological and ethical groundwork for the information age we inhabit today. It was a silent warrior, a magnificent machine whose victories were measured in the wars that were never fought. It flew into history, carrying something far heavier than film. It carried the future, A future of unbelievable knowledge and unsettling transparency. A future we are still struggling to understand. A future that is watching us right now from the cold, silent darkness above. The final film canister, retrieved from the last Corona mission in May 1972, contained something far more significant than images of Soviet missile silos. It held the closing chapter of a revolution. When the program began, its creators were engaged in a desperate, almost primitive struggle against the unknown, flinging complex machines into the void with the hope that one might survive to deliver a single clarifying truth. By the time it ended, that act was no longer a gamble. It was a routine, a predictable and essential function of state power. The journey between those 2 points was not just the story of a successful intelligence program. It was the story of how humanity built itself a new sense of sight, and in doing so, irrevocably altered its relationship with the planet, with its enemies, and with itself. The true legacy of Corona is not found in the tactical victories it secured, but in the strategic reality it created. It took the most dangerous conflict in history, a standoff fueled by paranoia and built on a foundation of mutual ignorance, and exposed it to the sanitizing light of verifiable fact. The missile gap was the first casualty, but the true target was the very nature of Cold War confrontation. The program transformed the conflict from one of blind terror into one of managed antagonism. It allowed leaders to step back from the precipice because for the first time they could see the edge. It was the invisible third party at the negotiating table for every landmark arms control treaty, the silent, trusted verifier that made agreements between mortal enemies possible. In one of history's greatest ironies, the most sophisticated espionage tool ever created became one of its most effective instruments of peace. It was a weapon whose greatest power was its ability to prevent wars from ever starting. In the end, the philosophical collision between the American and Soviet systems was decided not on a battlefield but in orbit. The KGB's mastery of human intelligence, its intricate web of agents and informants, was rendered tragically obsolete. How could a spy on the ground compete with an eye in the sky that saw everything? The American philosophy that technology could solve any problem, that data was more reliable than ideology, and that systems were more powerful than individuals, was vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. Corona represented the triumph of the slide rule over the interrogation room of the engineer over the spy master. It was a victory of a system of thought, a testament to an industrial and scientific culture that could orchestrate a symphony of thousands of moving parts to achieve a single audacious goal. And the echoes of that victory now surround us, so completely integrated into the fabric of our lives that they have become invisible. The lineage from that first grainy image of a Soviet airbase to the high-definition satellite view on your smartphone is direct and unbroken. Corona is the ghost in the machine of our globalized world. It is present in the GPS signal that guides us through unfamiliar cities, in the agricultural forecasts that help feed billions, and in the heartbreaking images that show the retreat of our glaciers. The power it once gave a president to avert nuclear war is the same fundamental power that now allows a journalist to expose human rights abuses or an aid worker to coordinate disaster relief. What began as an instrument to wage a Cold War has become an indispensable tool for managing a complex, interconnected planet. Its creators set out to map the enemy and ended up providing the blueprint for the modern world. Yet this inheritance is not without its shadows. The eternal question first posed by that unblinking eye in 1960 remains unanswered. In building a world without secrets, what have we sacrificed? The price of the stability Corona brought was the dawn of universal surveillance. The concept of an unobserved space of true privacy may have been the program's final, unlamented casualty. We are the children of Corona, living in the transparent world it created, grappling with the immense power and profound unease that comes with the ability to see everything, everywhere, all at once. It was a program shrouded in the deepest secrecy, yet its ultimate legacy was the end of secrets itself. It was the silent architect of our age, a weapon that reshaped our planet not by destroying it but by revealing it in its entirety. And in that total, unforgiving light, we have been forced to see not only our adversaries but ourselves more clearly than ever before.